Hey everyone, Carmen here, Managing Digital Editor at Ms., and I am with Joe Shapiro, a reporter in NPR's investigative unit. I'm very excited to be here with you today.
Well, I am too. Thanks, Carmen, for doing this.
Yeah, and thank you for being here and for that awesome discussion, which we also were live streaming from the Ms. account. So hopefully everyone tuned in, and I'm just excited to sort of keep it going. And yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me was that Deborah's organization is called Speaking for Ourselves, right?
Right, speaking for ourselves, right. So the idea that people with intellectual disabilities have not been heard, that other people speak for them, and they have wisdom, and they want to, it's important for them to be able to tell their stories and advocate for themselves, speaking for ourselves.
Yeah, and you as a storyteller sort of leveraging the power of their voices and then using your platform, right, to help them tell their stories at a louder volume. And so I feel like there's a lot that folks in the movement can learn from that kind of work. So I'm just curious as to sort of, how did you go about that process, making sure that you were centering those voices of the folks you were reporting about?
So I've been covering disability for a long time, and one thing I learned very quickly in writing about people with intellectual disabilities, what we used to call mental retardation, we call intellectual disabilities, was that they may have difficulty learning, processing information, but they often think very deeply about things, especially things that marginalize them, and they're often very wise, and they are often can solve their own problems. They think about these things, and they don't get credit for this, and they're not treated as their as adults, as being thoughtful, and they have a lot to say. They have a lot to. They are often the best guides to their own lives and what they need. And so, what I did in this series, when I wrote about this series about the sexual assault of people with intellectual disabilities and this very high rate of sexual assault that they deal with, we found 7 times the rate of others based on Justice Department information, unpublished data that we got. I wanted to make sure that we heard the voices of people with intellectual disabilities, because usually when we write about them, they're not in there.
Yeah.
They're in there as subjects, but their voices aren't there. So I wanted to make sure, and this was sort of hard because I had to talk to editors, I had to talk to our lawyers. How do we do this? How do we know that we can get their consent to talk about something serious about like their own sexual assaults? Sometimes I had problems where if they had a guardian or if the state was their guardian and these women wanted to tell their stories, and some of these women would say to me, I want to tell my story because I don't want other women with disabilities to go through what I went through. I want my voice heard. I want my story told. But maybe a parent would say, oh, no, I don't want you talking about it. Or the state guardian would say that. So in some cases, I had to negotiate with the state. And the woman was very clear, no. And she could give consent. She knew. And so, in some cases, with one woman in the first story, a woman named Pauline, I spent a lot of time with her to make sure she understood, well, if I do this is a radio story, it's going to be online, people will be able to find it. We had to talk about what that meant, and she had to talk to the people who, at the group home where she worked, and the staff that assisted her, and they spent a lot of time making sure she understood, but she was very clear, no, I understand this is public. She even wanted her picture in the pieces. Now, I didn't use her last name. I did use her first name. I didn't say what city she lived in. But this was important. So it was listening to the people with intellectual disabilities, treating them like I would treat anyone else that I interviewed, right? Not assuming that they were incapable of telling their stories, incapable of giving consent, and listening to them and making sure that I was respectful of them and what they wanted.
Yeah, and I mean, it had so much impact, right? Like telling their stories in their voices had such an impact.
I think you're right. That was crucial to hear their voices because people with intellectual disabilities, we don't hear their voices usually. So to hear them, to have them be important in these pieces. And in the last piece I did, I wanted to do it entirely in the voices of people with intellectual disabilities. They're the only people I interviewed, and then you heard my voice, but just you heard them telling their stories and speaking, I think, very wisely, thoughtfully about why they were often the victims of sexual assault, how they people didn't see them as people beyond their disability, about how they depended on other people, how they've been taught to trust other people, right? People with intellectual disabilities, we find, are often are more so than other people. When there's a sexual assault, it's not we know that's generally not a stranger, right? Who does the sexual assault, but that's even more so for people with intellectual disabilities because they are so dependent on other people. So if somebody wants to take advantage of them, in some ways they're more at risk, because I think about someone who does personal care for someone, right? Who somebody needs to get help getting out of bed, getting on the toilet, being bathed. You have somebody who's doing intimate care. Now those caregivers are crucial, and most caregivers are just amazing. But sometimes you have caregivers who will take advantage of that kind of dependency and closeness.
Yeah. And I mean, you've been sort of putting people with disabilities at the center of your stories for a long time, too.
I've been writing about people with disabilities for 30 plus years. They've taught me a lot. I wrote a book about the disability civil rights movement called No Pity, People with Disabilities Forging the New Civil Rights Movement. I wrote that over 25 years ago, but it's still, a lot of it's still up to date. It holds up because it tells some of the history, and that people with disabilities have a civil rights movement just like African Americans in this country, the LGBT community, women's movement. They learned from all those other civil rights movements, and they fought for laws that gave them independence, and everything from education. People with disabilities were the last group in this country to win the right to a public education until 1975. And then after that, they won the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination in public places and gives them access to the law.
Yeah, and I mean, we talk a lot, I feel, in movement spaces about this notion that if you put folks who are at the intersections at the center of what you do, right, that everyone benefits. That
Yes.
Do you feel that there's a similar impact for you in sort of centering these kinds of voices in your storytelling?
I do, and the point you made is really important, because the civil rights that we win for people with disabilities ends up helping all of us, right? Especially as we're dealing with an aging society, and as we age, we're more likely to deal with disability. I mean, eventually, most people, older people, are going to have to deal with some disability, even though we don't like to admit to having a disability. A lot of people are helped by the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I found, for people with sort of minor disabilities, they don't think of themselves as having a disability. I did a story on the 25th anniversary of the signing of the ADA. It was signed in 1990 by President George H.W. Bush. And I interviewed a New York City police officer who, in a shootout, his partner had shot off her gun, but close to his ear, and he lost some hearing in his ear. And the New York City Police Department paid for his hearing aid. But once he had a hearing aid, they said, "You can't be a cop anymore." And he said, "Well, that's ridiculous. I can hear better now than I did before. And with the hearing aid, that I can do my job." And they said, "Well, but you have a disability." He didn't think of himself as disabled, right?
Yeah.
And then part of it was this macho cop thing, right? He said, I think of myself as the warrior. I can't think of myself as having a disability." But he used the civil rights law, the ADA, even though he didn't like to call himself, at first he wouldn't call himself disabled. He used that law to then win back his job. And the New York City Police Department, in a settlement, changed the law so that a minor disability, like having some hearing loss that's corrected with a hearing aid, did not preclude someone from being a police officer. So he ended up helping lots of people, right?
Yeah.
Even though he didn't really, in the end, he would admit that he had a disability, but it was hard. At first he did. So this is a law. We often think we passed the ADA to help people in wheelchairs or blind or deaf, people with intellectual disabilities, but it really ends up helping lots of people, people who may not even think of themselves as having a disability, people with more minor disabilities. So yes, and it's there to protect all of us, I think, as we age, and also creates a more sort of open society. I think about things like, curb cuts, right? I mean, who uses them? When my kids were small and I had them in strollers, I used the curb cut. People, with bicycles, right? I mean, that's something there, that ends up not just helping somebody with with disabilities. It helps lots of people. In that same story I did with the police officer, I went around New York City with a lawyer who sued the city over different issues of access. And we actually went to a subway station where they sued and they forced the city to put an elevator. The city was renovating the subway station, and they said it was too expensive to put on an elevator. And we went to see who was using that elevator, and it was older people. It was people carrying their groceries in a cart. It was basically anyone who didn't want to walk up those steep steps.
Yeah.
It was there for everyone. So yes, so civil rights laws are often there to. I think civil rights laws end up helping all of us, creating a more open society, and I've learned that from the disability rights.
Yeah, and I mean, you've also zeroed in a lot on sexual assault in your reporting, and the work you did on campus sexual assault sort of led to these dear colleague letters and this guidance.
And that was when we started the investigations unit at NPR in 2010. That was the first series we did. I got to work with Kristen Lombardi, who was already starting this series for the Center for Public Integrity, and so we teamed up, CPI and NPR, and we did what I think was this really groundbreaking series looking at the failure of college campuses to adequately investigate and sexual assault, and then to adequately punish people men who've been found responsible for sexual assault. And we found this issue that often there'd be some light punishment, and then the woman would end up in the same dormitory, in the same classroom with the man who'd been found responsible for assaulting her. And that helped push the Obama administration to make change. First with that Dear Colleague letter. Our series came out in January and February of 2010, and then so a year later, the Dear Colleague letter. Then Congress passed the Campus Save Act, which put a lot of that into law, right? So that the current administration can't get rid of all of it because a lot of that ended up in law. And then the Obama administration did their further work on trying to change, support colleges and trying to change how they deal with sexual assault issues. So that's a series I'm really proud of. We had some impact, and also this series. And after that, because I'd done all the disability stuff, I wanted to write about sexual assault of people with intellectual disabilities, and I think that's had some good impact too. A lot of we certainly raised a lot of awareness. There's more money for trying to teach healthy sexuality, which people with intellectual disabilities often don't get. Trying to do more to train police and prosecutors in how to deal with these cases.
Yeah, well, and I was curious if you sort of, in the process of, writing about maybe gaps on campus sexual assault and then writing about these disability laws and then doing this series that sort of combined all of these things, where are the gaps in policy that are making it sort of possible for people with disabilities to be sort of left behind in the work that we've done around sexual violence? I mean, watching the three of you on stage and even just being present for this conversation and thinking about the series and sort of realizing that I've been doing this work for so long and I don't really hear the voices of people with disabilities, even in spaces that are about these issues.
Well, I think that's part of the reason for the gap, is that we don't hear them. We heard Debbie Robinson and Carolyn Morgan today talk about how they weren't believed by their own family. Carolyn said, "Oh, the police said, oh, well, you must have wanted this, right?"
Mm-hmm.
They didn't believe that a person with an intellectual disability could speak honestly or could be believed. I quoted this man, Thomas Mangrum, who talked about that. People think that we're childlike and we can't be trusted. They have often a hard time telling their stories in courtrooms because abstract concepts are hard, time sequence is hard, so it's easy for them to be sound confused if they're trying to explain it. They say, what day was it? When did it happen? How many times? I told the story of one woman, this woman Pauline, who I mentioned. She knew what happened, but she didn't know what days it was. These happened, time of the day. Those are more abstract concepts, but actually in her case, after she was sexually assaulted, she insisted on that the woman who ran her house call the police, and she spoke up for herself, and that made a difference. But the police were unsure whether or not to prosecute because she couldn't remember dates. But in the end, they did.
Yeah, and what resources were there a lot of specific resources that the survivors you talked to cited that maybe could be good best practices or models for folks in the movement to work into the stuff they're doing?
Well, there's training. One of the men that I interviewed who is a survivor, James Metters, talks about how now he volunteers at the Rape Crisis Center in the city where he lives. So it's listening to people with intellectual disabilities, learning about their experience, learning about how to interview them. I did a story about prosecutors in New Jersey who get trained in how to talk to people with intellectual disabilities. Now they use a training method that they also use for dealing with children. It's not, it's not a perfect. They're not equal. It's not the people with intellectual disabilities aren't children, but some of the things apply. This issue of asking concrete questions, not abstract questions. What time was it? What day of the week it was? You can ask things like, what were you doing? Were you if you're watching television, you're trying to find out a time. What show were you watching? Were you eating dinner? You can establish time in other more concrete ways.
Yeah, and sort of having done all this, and then there's this Me Too explosion that happens. Do you feel like we're all here at this conference sort of talking about the Me Too movement as this big breakthrough, as this sea change. But when I was watching the three of you talk, I just kept thinking, I don't really know that the Me Too movement was a sea change for survivors with disabilities, because I don't really know that they were visible or centered in a lot of the stuff that happened subsequently. And I'm wondering if you think there's been, a moment for them too.
They haven't quite had their moment, but people in the Me Too movement and Time's Up have reached out and have tried to figure out how to give them their moment. So they're not being. So I think they're being included. I did talk to the National Women's Law Center and the Student Time's Up about some of this. So they are thinking seriously about how to include people with disabilities. So I don't think they quite had their moment yet, but I give the movement credit for trying to thinking about this and how to include it.
Yeah, and what do you think, sort of having had this finger on the pulse of these different social movements, what do you think that that we can do to usher in that breakthrough? Like beyond even just reaching out, what are some of the concrete sort of things we should maybe be advocating for, or ways we could change the processes that we use?
Right. So that's a good. So these are good questions. I should have come up with a toolkit here. I guess it's,
we can write one right now.
I know. Let's see. Let me think about it. So what can we do? Getting to know people with disabilities, all disabilities, meeting them at the places where they are. So people with often with physical disabilities have in every city there's something called an independent living center. These are centers run by people, usually with physical disabilities, often with psychiatric disabilities, centers that are run by them to help other people with disabilities deal with every kind of issue, from getting a social security check to dealing with a sexual assault issue. So dealing with them, with the people with intellectual disabilities, I spoke to people who are part of what they call the self-advocacy movement, where they advocate for themselves. And again, part of the self-advocacy is defining what issues are important to them. So when I met self-advocates, they'd often tell me about sexual assault issues, which is why I realized I had to write about it.
Yeah.
So it's finding these people, talking to them, treating them seriously, giving them the respect that they deserve, and realizing that they want the same things that everybody else wants. They want to be treated the same way as everyone else. Part of it is not being afraid. We're often afraid to talk to people with disabilities. We don't know quite the right language. We're afraid we're going to insult them. So I think it's people with disabilities have been my teachers. And if I use the wrong language, if you don't know the language, you can ask them, what they want. Just right, like in any community, you ask people what language they prefer. Don't let your being concerned about saying the wrong thing keep you from interacting with them. Right? Ask them. They appreciate somebody who wants to learn and will listen. So I think reaching out to them, including them in our communities, including them in the conversation, realize that they do have something to say, and not being afraid that I'm going to say the wrong thing or I don't know how to interact with them. Once you do, you find out they're like everyone else. They want the same things. They deserve the same respect, and they can be good teachers.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Thank you so much.
I mean, thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you. Thanks for everyone who's
tuning in.
Yeah, that's good. All right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.